She was on her knees in frozen mud, surrounded by people who had known her name since childhood, and not one of them moved. The mayor's voice cut through the winter air like a blade. "You have until sundown to leave this valley, or we bury you in it." 400 people watched. 400 people said nothing. And then, from the far edge of the crowd, a shadow moved against the snow. Tall, scarred, and carrying the kind of silence that makes men step back without knowing why. He looked at the mayor. He looked at the woman bleeding in the mud. Then he said just 4 words. "She's coming with me." If you want to know how a woman left for dead in the dirt ended up saving a man's life on a mountain in the middle of winter, then stay right here. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. This is her story, all of it, from the mud to the mountain. Let's begin. The thing nobody tells you about hitting rock bottom is that the ground is cold. Not just cold the way an autumn morning is cold, where you pull your coat tighter and keep walking. Cold in a way that seeps through cloth and skin and settles somewhere behind your ribs, like it's looking for a permanent place to stay. Cold that makes your fingers stop bending right. Cold that makes the simple act of pushing yourself upright feel like the hardest thing you've ever attempted. Elena Mercer had been trying to get up for the better part of 3 minutes. Around her, the boots of Oak Ridge shifted in the mud. Work boots, riding boots, the fine leather shoes of men who own things. And not a single pair moved toward her. A few stepped back, actually, the way people do when they don't want to be associated with something embarrassing, as if poverty were contagious, as if her bad luck might jump from her skin to theirs if they got too close. She was 24 years old and she weighed about 112 pounds, which was down from the 130 she'd carried when her husband was still alive. Her dress had been brown once, or maybe dark green. It was difficult to say anymore, the color having surrendered entirely to grime and repeated hand-washing in creek water. Her boots had a crack along the left sole that let in moisture every time she stepped in anything soft, which in November in mountain country meant constantly. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. Half a biscuit, left outside the bakery door, that she was fairly certain had been intended for the stray dog that sometimes slept under the baker's porch. She'd eaten it anyway, standing in the alley with her back turned to the street so nobody could see her do it. That had been yesterday. She got one knee under her. The mud made a sucking sound, reluctant to let her go. "Don't strain yourself," said a woman's voice from the crowd. Not kind, amused. "She'll just end up back down." A few people laughed. The sound of it hit Elena somewhere between her shoulder blades, not sharp like a slap, more like a dull pressure, the kind that accumulates over months until your posture changes trying to accommodate it. She got her other knee under her and pushed. Standing took 4 attempts. By the time she was upright, her palms were bleeding from where gravel had bitten into them, and her left knee had twisted slightly on the way up and was now informing her, loudly, that it intended to make her pay for that all evening. She stood anyway. She lifted her chin. Elena Mercer. The voice came from the raised wooden platform in front of the sheriff's office, where Mayor Gerald Holt stood with his thumbs in his vest pockets and the particular expression of a man who has decided something and enjoys the deciding of it. He was 53, red-faced from whiskey and cold weather, with a mustache he groomed carefully every morning because it was the only orderly thing about him. "You are 3 months behind on your late husband's debts," Holt said. His voice carried easily. The square was not large, and the crowd was quiet the way crowds get when they're about to watch something unpleasant and haven't decided yet whether to feel guilty about it. The mercantile, the feed store, the livery, totaling, he made a show of consulting the paper in his hand, though Elena suspected he had those numbers memorized. $41.60. $41.60. She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was such a specific number for a life to collapse around. $41.60 was the price of everything. Her freedom, her future, what little remained of her dignity. "I've been trying to find work," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. "I've asked at the hotel, the laundry, Nobody in Oak Ridge is obligated to employ the wife of a murderer." Holt cut her off without raising his voice. He didn't need to. "Your husband robbed the Western Continental at Dalton Pass. 6 men dead, including 2 railroad guards with families. The town's made its decision about where it stands." "I wasn't on that train." No, you were here, spending money that came from God knows where. He told me he was hauling freight. I didn't. You have until sundown to leave this valley. The finality in Holt's voice was the kind that comes from a man who's been the largest person in every room he's ever entered. If you're still inside Oak Ridge limits by dark, the sheriff will escort you out personally. Whatever you can carry, you carry. Whatever you can't, stays. The square was silent except for wind pulling at coat collars and hat brims. Elena looked at the faces around her. She recognized most of them. The blacksmith, Jacob Pratt, who used to tip his hat to her at church. Mary Calloway from the seamstress shop, who had taught Elena a cross-stitch pattern 2 summers ago and called her dear while doing it. Old Tom Weber, who sat outside the barber shop every afternoon and always had a kind word for everyone who passed. None of them would meet her eyes now. She was searching for something, not rescue. She'd stopped hoping for that, but just a single face willing to acknowledge that what was happening here was wrong. One person. The mud on her knees was starting to freeze in the wind. She didn't find what she was looking for. And then the crowd moved. Not dramatically, not the way crowds part in stories, with purpose and theater. People simply shifted, the way water moves around an obstacle, and through the gap that opened walked a man who did not belong to this town in any way that was immediately obvious. He was large, not in the way of men who've gotten fat on comfort, but in the way of something structural, like a barn or a cliff face, the kind of large that suggests weight-bearing. He wore a canvas duster coat that had been repaired in several places with different thread, none of it matching, and a felt hat with a brim that had lost its original shape entirely. His boots were functional and expensive and had seen enormous amounts of terrain. His face was not what Elena expected. There was a scar that ran from his left cheekbone down to the jaw, old and well-healed, but visible, pulling that side of his expression into something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a frown, just an ambiguity that made him difficult to read. His eyes were dark. She couldn't tell exactly what color in the flat winter light. And they moved across the crowd with the systematic attention of a man who had learned to assess spaces quickly and was doing so now. He looked at the mayor. He looked at Elena. He looked at the space between them and appeared to make a calculation. "How much?" he said. The mayor blinked. "I beg the debt." The man's voice was low. Not a performance of calm, just actually calm, which was somehow more unsettling. "You said 4160. How much of that needs to be paid today to keep her in this town?" A murmur moved through the crowd. Mayor Holt's expression changed. Not much, just a tightening around the eyes, the particular displeasure of a man whose carefully arranged moment is being interrupted. "This isn't a matter of payment anymore," Holt said. "This is a matter of... I'm not asking what it's a matter of. I'm asking what it costs." The man pulled something from inside his coat, a leather pouch, worn soft with handling, and held it in one hand without opening it. "Simple question, Mayor." Holt's mustache twitched. "Who exactly are you?" "Ronan Blackwood." He said it without inflection, the way you state a fact that doesn't require embellishment. "I trap the Upper Crestline Range. I come to town twice a year for supplies. The man at the Mercantile knows me." From somewhere in the crowd, a voice confirmed this quietly. Elena didn't see who. Something shifted in the square. Not large, but real. A few people exchanged looks. A few more stepped back slightly from the mayor's platform, just a half step, just enough to not be quite so directly aligned with his position. Holt cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, the situation here, Ronan said, is that you're turning a sick woman out in November. The mountain passes will close in 3 days. You know that. Everybody here knows that." He looked at the crowd when he said it, not accusing, just stating. "She goes out those passes in her condition. She's dead before the week's out. That is not what she owes." He opened the pouch. "Tell me what she owes." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Elena counted them, standing in her slowly freezing mud with bleeding palms and an aching knee, watching a stranger she had never seen before in her life hold a pouch of money in the center of her town square. She should have felt something. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or the first spark of hope. Mostly what she felt was suspicious. Men did not do things like this for nothing. She knew that better than most. He paid the debts in full. Right there in the square, with the mayor watching and the crowd watching and Elena watching from a few feet away, Ronan Blackwood counted out $41.60 from that worn leather pouch and handed it to Mayor Holt with the particular efficiency of a man completing a task he'd already made up his mind about. Holt counted the money twice. He looked at Elena. He looked at Ronan. His expression suggested he was trying to find the mechanism by which to refuse, but the mechanism didn't exist. A debt paid was a debt cleared, and whatever other grounds he might have had for exile, he hadn't stated them explicitly enough to retreat to now. "This changes nothing about how this town feels," Holt said finally. "I didn't pay it to change your feelings." Ronan pocketed the pouch. "I paid it to clear her name in the ledger." He turned to Elena. Up close, he was even larger than he'd appeared from across the square. She was 5'4", and she had to tilt her head back noticeably to look at his face. The scar was more visible at this distance. So were the lines around his eyes, which suggested he was somewhere in his middle 30s, or perhaps younger than that, but built to look older by weather and whatever else had happened to him. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely place. Not pity. She'd become very familiar with what pity looked like on people's faces over the past 6 months. And this wasn't it. Something more like assessment, a direct, careful study, the way you look at a piece of equipment you're considering depending on for your survival. "I have a cabin at 6,000 feet on the north face of Storm Crest," he said. "It's 2 rooms, wood heat, 2 months of provisions already laid in. I need someone to manage it through the winter while I'm running trap lines." Elena stared at him. "In exchange," he continued, "you'd have shelter, food, and a safe distance from—" He glanced back at the crowd, not unkindly. "All of this. Come spring, whatever arrangement you want to make is your choice." She stared at him for another moment. "You just paid $41, she said carefully, "to offer me a job." "Yes." "As a housekeeper?" "More or less." "You don't know me." "No." "You don't know anything about me." "I know you got up," he said. 4 times. I was watching from the tree line when you came into the square. Most people wouldn't have kept getting up." Elena looked at his face and tried to find the angle. There was always an angle. She had learned that from Thomas, her husband, in the 2 years of their marriage. The way kindness from strangers usually has a floor you can't see until you've already fallen through it. "Why?" she asked. He seemed to think about this. Not performing thought, actually considering the question. "Because nobody else was going to," he said, which was either the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months or a very good line. And the thing was, she was standing in a frozen square with no money, no shelter, and winter coming down the mountain like a wall. The passes would close in 3 days. He was right about that. She didn't have the luxury of being too careful. "All right," she said. A sound moved through the crowd. Not quite disapproval, not quite surprise. Something in between. "You can't be serious," someone said. She didn't look to see who. "Going off into the mountains with that man? You don't know the first thing about him." "She's better off dead in a snowbank," someone else said, louder. "Maybe she is," Ronan said, still looking at Elena. "Her call." Elena picked up the small canvas bag that held everything she still owned. A change of clothes, a photograph, a pocket knife she'd carried since she was 16. It wasn't heavy. She looked at Ronan Blackwood. "I'll need 5 minutes to collect the rest of my things from the boarding house," she said. He nodded once and walked toward the horses without looking back at the mayor, the crowd, or any of it. Elena followed him. She did not look back either. She heard Mayor Holt say something as they left the square, something sharp and certain about how it would end. But the wind picked it up and scattered it before she could make out the words, and she decided that was fine. Some things you don't need to hear twice. The boarding house where Elena had been staying being a generous term for sleeping in a basement storage room the landlady had grudgingly offered in exchange for help with laundry, was 2 blocks from the square. Ronan waited outside with the horses while she went in. The landlady, Mrs. Huckett, was in the front hallway when Elena came through the door, which meant she'd been watching from the window. She was 60, lean, with the particular expression of a woman who had formed opinions and stuck with them regardless of new information. "Heard what happened," Mrs. Huckett said, blocking the hallway in the sideways way of someone who wants to impede without appearing to. "I'm getting my things." Elena moved past her. Mrs. Huckett turned to follow. "That man is dangerous," she said. "Ronan Blackwood. People talk. They say he went to prison once. They say he killed a man up on Crestline 3 years back, and the body was never found. They say... People in this town say a lot of things." Elena crouched by the small pile of belongings in the corner of the storage room and started putting them into her canvas bag. There wasn't much to arrange. "I've noticed that most of what they say is whatever's most convenient for them at the time." Mrs. Huckett was quiet for a moment. "That's not fair," she said. Elena looked up at her. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Huckett. Nothing about the last 6 months has been fair. You know that. You've watched most of it from that front window." She straightened. The bag was packed. She looked around the storage room one more time, in case she'd missed anything. She hadn't. "Thank you for the room. I know you didn't have to offer it." That part was genuine. Whatever else she thought of the woman, the room had been something when nothing was the alternative. Mrs. Huckett stepped aside in the hallway. "You watch yourself," she said, quieter now, the performance of certainty somewhat diminished. "Whatever else anybody says about it." Elena nodded and went back out into the cold. Ronan was where she'd left him, holding the reins of both horses with an easy hand. He'd mounted by the time she reached him, and he looked at her bag with an expression that suggested he was calculating whether she'd need help securing it. "I can manage it," she said, and he nodded and didn't offer again. They rode north out of Oak Ridge without ceremony. Nobody came to the edge of town to see them off. One small boy, standing on a porch, watched them pass with the uncomplicated curiosity of someone too young to know he was supposed to feel differently. Elena looked at him as they rode by. He waved. She waved back. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in longer than she could remember. The road north, insofar as it was a road, which it quickly stopped being, climbed out of the valley through a mix of pine and aspen, the aspens bare now, their pale trunks making the forest look skeletal against the sky. The cold intensified with altitude. Elena's left boot let in water where the sole had cracked. They rode for most of an hour without speaking. She watched him from the corner of her eye. The way he rode, which was economical and practiced. The way he tracked the tree line as they moved through it. Not anxious, just attentive. The way the horse trusted him, which she'd learned to use as information. "The rumors," she said finally. "Mrs. Huckett told me about them." He didn't look at her. "Which ones?" "Prison. The man on Crestline." "One is true." He paused. "The other isn't." She waited. "The man on Crestline," he said. "I didn't kill him. I found him. He'd been dead 2 days before I came across him, caught out in a late-season storm without proper gear, which happens to people who underestimate the mountain. He was quiet for a moment. I reported it to the county marshal, took his effects to his family in Durnan. The marshal cleared me in 4 days. But the story people tell is more interesting than the truth, so." "And prison?" A longer pause. 7 years ago," he said. 2 years served. I won't tell you what for tonight." "Tonight." She noted that. Not never. Tonight. Which meant he intended there to be more conversations, which either meant he was being honest with her about the ongoing nature of their arrangement, or he was managing her carefully. "That's fair enough," she said. He glanced at her then, just briefly, a side-eye assessment, and something in his expression shifted by about 2 degrees in the direction of less guarded. They didn't speak again until the town was long behind them, and the mountain had fully absorbed them into its own logic, where the concerns of Oak Ridge seemed less immediate and somehow smaller, and the things that mattered were simpler. Wind direction, the quality of the snow underfoot, whether the horses were tiring. Elena breathed cold air and felt, strangely, incrementally, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happy. Not safe, exactly. Just slightly less crushed, which was, under the circumstances, enough. The cabin at Stormcrest came into view at late afternoon, when the light had gone flat and gray, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees from what it had been in the valley. Elena's first impression was that it was smaller than she'd expected. Her second impression, arriving immediately afterward, was that it was more solid, built from timber in a way that looked intentional rather than hasty, set back against a rock outcropping that would shield it from the worst of the northern wind. A woodpile stacked against the east wall, waist high, covered with oilskin, a smaller outbuilding behind for the horses. Her third impression was that it was very, very far from anything else. The nearest other structure she'd been watching as they rode was the remains of a trapper's lean-to they'd passed about 4 miles back, which didn't look like it had been inhabited since before she was born. No road reached the cabin, just the trail they'd come in on. The valley below had completely disappeared behind a ridgeline. In every direction except back the way they'd come, the world was rock and pine and snow. "It's quiet," she said. "Yes." He dismounted and was leading the horses toward the outbuilding. "That's most of the point." She dismounted on her own. Her knee protested, but she didn't acknowledge it, and looked at the cabin. There was something comforting about it, she found, and something else, underneath the comfort, that she couldn't quite name. A quality the place had, like a held breath. The mountain is hiding something. She didn't know why she thought that. She shook it off. She was tired and hungry and cold, and her imagination had been overwrought for months. She followed Ronan inside. The interior was one large room and one smaller, divided by a wall of half-logs. The main room had a stone fireplace at one end, a cast-iron cook stove, a table with 2 chairs, and shelving along the north wall holding provisions. Canned goods, dried beans, salt pork, flour, enough that she could see at a glance they would not starve. The second room had a rope bed, narrow, and a smaller cot that had been added more recently. The wood was newer, lighter. "You take the bed," Ronan said, putting her bag on it without ceremony. "I'll take the cot." "That's your bed." "I sleep 4 hours a night. It doesn't matter." She stood in the middle of the main room while he built up the fire, which he did with the same efficiency he seemed to apply to everything. No wasted motion, no unnecessary steps. Within 10 minutes, the fire was going, and within 20, the room had moved from frigid to merely cold. He made food, simple, just salt pork and biscuits from a batch he'd mixed that morning, apparently, before riding down to Oak Ridge. He set a plate in front of her and sat across the table with his own. She ate. She hadn't eaten since the biscuit in the alley, and the hunger had moved past the painful stage into something more like a dull, insistent emptiness. She tried not to eat too fast. She wasn't sure she entirely succeeded. He didn't comment on it. "Ground rules," he said, when she was most of the way through. He hadn't moved much while she ate, just sat with his food and a mug of coffee that she noticed he held in his right hand while his left stayed below the table, which was a thing she filed away without comment. "I'm on the trap line from before dawn until early afternoon most days. You have the run of the place. You can go out, but don't go past the south tree line alone. There's a pack working that area, and they haven't decided yet whether people are worth the trouble. The cellar—" He stopped. Just for a half second, something moved across his face. "The cellar is locked," he said. "The door is under the rug there by the east wall. You'll see it. Leave it alone." Elena looked at the rug by the east wall. It was unremarkable. Worn wool, dark colors. She looked back at him. "All right," she said. "I mean it." He met her eyes directly. "I don't mean it as a challenge. I mean it for practical reasons that I'll explain at a time when there's a better situation for explaining them. Just leave the door alone." She held his gaze. "You have provisions in the cellar," she offered. "Something that would spoil if it was accessed at the wrong temperature." Something moved in his expression that might have been appreciation. "Sure," he said. "Exactly that." They both knew she didn't believe him, and they both knew that she was choosing to let it go. Which was, she was beginning to understand how most things between them were going to work, at least for now. "Understood," she said, and turned back to her food. The fire crackled. Wind moved against the cabin walls with the steady pressure of something that has been pushing at things for a very long time. Elena ate the rest of her meal in silence, and it was the best meal she could remember having, and she did not look at the rug by the east wall again that night, though she was aware of it with that specific edge of the mind that is reserved for things being deliberately not thought about. The first week was hard in ways she hadn't anticipated. The work wasn't the problem. Elena had been working since she was 9 years old. The Mercer farm hadn't run itself, and her father had believed in child labor with an enthusiasm that his 3 daughters had collectively resented and separately survived. She knew how to manage a fire, how to keep provisions, how to do the 1,000 small tasks of a household existing at a remove from civilization. Those she could do. The solitude was harder. She'd been surrounded by people in Oak Ridge, surrounded by hostility, but surrounded. The absence of sound, of other voices, of the thousand background noises of a human settlement pressed on her in ways she hadn't expected. The mountain was loud with wind and tree and occasional wildlife, but those were sounds of a different category, and her ears kept reaching for something familiar that wasn't there. Ronan left before dawn and returned in early afternoon, and the hours between were very long. On the second day, she organized everything in the main room, not because it needed organizing, he kept a clean and logical space, but because she needed to do something. On the third day, she found a small pile of books on a shelf behind the wood box and read for most of the afternoon. On the fourth day, she walked south to the tree line and stood there for a while looking at the valley below, which was so far down it might have been a different world, which in most of the ways that mattered, it was. She didn't cross the tree line, not because she'd been told not to, exactly, but because she could hear the wolves at night, and the quality of the sound, low, frequent, casual, suggested animals that weren't afraid, which meant animals that were comfortable, which in her experience with wolves meant animals that had learned there was nothing in their territory to fear. On the fifth day it snowed, not the light decorative snow of early season, real snow, driven horizontal by wind, the kind that builds fast and accumulates with intent. By midday the outbuilding was half buried, and the trail they'd ridden in on had disappeared entirely. Elena stoked the fire and watched the snow through the small window above the cook stove and calculated that if Ronan wasn't back by late afternoon, he might not be making it back at all. He came through the door at 3 o'clock, so covered in snow that she didn't recognize him for a half second, just registered a large shape forcing its way through the wind and felt her hand close around the knife she'd set on the table beside her book. He stopped just inside the door and looked at her. Looked at the knife. "Glad to know you're paying attention," he said. She set it back on the table. "I thought you might not make it. I know these trails in the dark." He pulled the ice off his coat. Actual ice, sheeted across the back of it. "You kept the fire up?" "Yes." He sat by the fire and pulled off his boots, which were packed with snow. He moved slowly, she noticed. Not injured, but tired in a way that was more than physical. Like something about the storm had cost him beyond the effort of riding through it. "You all right?" she asked. He looked at her. That sideways look again, measuring something. "Yes," he said. "Bad weather's just bad weather. You don't have to answer everything like I'm going to use it against you." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Habit," he said. "I know." She got up and filled a bowl from the pot she'd kept on the stove and set it in front of him. "I have a few of those myself." He ate. She went back to her book. After a while he said, "What are you reading?" She turned the cover toward him, a collection of short stories. She'd found it behind the wood box. "It's good," she said. "Whoever picked it had decent taste." "My father," he said, and then, like he'd surprised himself, "He died a long time ago. I kept some of his books." Elena looked at the book in her hand. The spine was soft with handling. Not one reading, but many. "He read it a lot," she said. "He liked winter evenings." Ronan was looking at the fire. "Said books were what you had when you couldn't be anywhere else." Elena thought about her father, who had not liked books at all, who had thought that reading was what you did when you ran out of actual things to do, which in his worldview was never. She thought about how a person could be shaped by what they grew up inside, the small preferences and habits of their parents becoming the furniture of their inner life without them ever deciding it should be so. "He sounds better than mine," she said. Ronan looked at her. It was the first personal thing she'd offered, and she saw him register it. "Probably," he said. "Most people were." Which was its own kind of offering, she thought. They were trading small pieces of themselves across the table, in the particular economy of two people who have reason to be careful and are choosing, slowly, not to be. Outside, the storm pushed against the cabin walls. The locked cellar door was under the rug by the east wall, 10 feet from where she was sitting. It didn't make a sound. Not that night. The first sound came on the 9th night. Elena had been asleep for maybe 2 hours. She was still adjusting to the mountain's schedule, where darkness came early and complete, and her body kept waking her at odd hours with the residual anxiety of someone who'd been unsafe for months and hadn't fully processed that the situation had changed. She lay in the dark and listened. At first she thought it was the wind shifting. The cabin settled and creaked, and the sound moved through wood differently depending on direction. But then it came again, and it was distinctly not the wind, a rhythmic dry sound, scratching, like something dragging its fingers across the underside of wood, from below the floor. She sat up. The fire in the main room had burned down to coals. She could see the faint orange glow under the door. The sound stopped. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then it started again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. She reached for the knife on the bedside ledge. She'd started keeping it there, and got quietly out of bed, opened the bedroom door. The main room was dim and orange shadowed. Nothing moved. The rug by the east wall was still, just a rug, but the sound was coming from under it. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, knife in hand, telling herself a variety of sensible things. Animals could get under cabins. It could be a rat or a marmot. It could be ice shifting. It could be any number of mundane explanations. She was constructing these explanations with some energy when the cot in the corner moved, and Ronan sat up. He was fully awake immediately, in the way of men who train themselves to sleep lightly. He looked at her, then at the direction she was looking. "Go back to bed," he said. His voice was quiet and flat. "There's something, I know." He was already standing, his boots going on with practiced efficiency. "Go back to bed and close the door." "Ronan." "Elena." He looked at her directly, and something in the look made her stop. Not fear. Something more controlled than fear, and somehow more serious for that. "Close the door." She went back to the bedroom and closed the door. She did not go back to sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to him moving in the main room. Slow, quiet movements, then a long stillness, then what might have been his voice, very low, saying something she couldn't make out through the half-log wall. Then silence. Then nothing else. And eventually, much later than she'd expected, sleep. In the morning, he was up before her and had coffee made, and there was a quality to the way he sat at the table that suggested a man who had spent a portion of the night making decisions. He did not bring up the sounds. She did not ask. They ate breakfast with the particular careful courtesy of two people who have agreed without discussing it to not have a conversation they're not ready to have. It went like that for another 3 nights. The sounds came and went, sometimes scratching, sometimes something that might have been knocking, rhythmic and low. She stopped getting up, because getting up hadn't given her any additional information. She lay still and listened to the quiet life of whatever was happening beneath the cabin floor, and she made herself not think about it with such concentrated effort that it occupied most of her thoughts. On the 12th night, lying in the dark with the scratching below, she heard something that made every other consideration irrelevant. A voice. Low, rough, slightly distorted by the floor and distance, but unmistakably human, saying something that took her a moment to parse, saying her name. Elena. She didn't move for a very long time. The fire crackled. Wind moved the cabin around her. Below the floor, nothing else came. Just that one word, hung in the middle of the night like something left for her to find. She lay in the dark until the sky began to lighten. When Ronan left before dawn for the trapline, she said nothing. When he returned at midday, she said nothing. She sat by the fire and looked at the rug by the east wall and thought about what she knew and what she didn't, and what the difference was, and whether it mattered. Something was alive in the cellar beneath this cabin, something that knew her name, and the man who had brought her here had not told her why. She didn't sleep the following night either, but for different reasons. The voice had stopped. That was almost worse. The silence below the floor had a quality to it now that it hadn't had before, something watchful and patient, like whatever was down there had gotten what it wanted from her and could afford to wait. She lay in the narrow rope bed and stared at the ceiling planks and ran the sound of it through her mind on repeat. Low, rough, distorted by wood and distance but clear enough. Her name, in a man's voice she didn't recognize. Not a dream. She'd been awake for certain. She'd been tracing a knot in the ceiling boards with her eyes before it happened, and she'd still been tracing it after. She got up before Ronan left for the trapline. He was already at the stove when she came through the bedroom door, his back to her, and he turned when he heard her. the particular alertness of a man who notices everything shifting only slightly when he saw it was her. "Coffee's made," he said.
"I know." She sat at the table. "Ronan." Something about her voice made him put down the mug he'd been about to hand her. He turned fully. "Yeah." "Last night," she said, "something in the cellar said my name." He was very still. "I wasn't asleep," she continued. "I want to make that clear. I've been lying awake most nights anyway. I know the difference between hearing something and dreaming something. A man's voice said my name through the floor."
Ronan pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her. He put his hands flat on the table, both of them, which was the first time she'd seen his left hand clearly in daylight. 3 of the fingers on it didn't sit quite right, the kind of healing that happens when bones are set without a doctor. Old damage. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "His name is Silas Crow," he said. "He's been down there for 11 days. Elena said nothing. She waited. "He's alive, he's fed, he's not being hurt." He said this like a man establishing facts, not seeking absolution. "He's down there because I put him there, and he's staying down there until I decide what to do with him." "That's not—" She stopped, started again. "You have a man locked in your cellar." "Yes." "Against his will." "He doesn't have a will about it that I'm concerned with, no." She looked at him. "That's not a legal arrangement." "No, it's not. It's also not what you told me the cellar was." He held her gaze. "I told you the cellar was locked, and to leave it alone." "You implied provisions." "I implied nothing. You inferred it, and I didn't correct you." He said this evenly, without defensiveness, which was somehow more irritating than if he'd been defensive. "I'm telling you now." Elena sat back in the chair. She pressed her palms against the edge of the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at him. "All right," she said slowly. "Who is he?" Ronan was quiet for a few seconds. Then, "You know about the Dalton Pass robbery?" The air in the room changed. She felt it the way you feel a temperature drop. Sudden, full body, impossible to mistake. "That's how they tried Thomas," she said carefully. 6 men killed. $40,000 from the Western Continental. "Your husband wasn't the man who planned that job." Ronan's voice was flat and deliberate. "He was a hired hand who knew the timing and the route. The man who planned it, who bankrolled it, who arranged for those guards to be undermanned that night. That man is still walking around free, has been this whole time." Elena's throat tightened. "Thomas never told me who. He probably didn't know the full chain. These things work in layers." Ronan picked up his coffee mug and then put it back down without drinking. Silas Crow was the intermediary, the man between the planner and the people who actually pulled the trigger. He carried the instructions, he held the money before it moved, and when the law started pulling on threads, he ran. "And you found him." "I found him 3 weeks ago, drunk and broke and hiding in a mining camp 2 ranges over." Something moved in his face. Not satisfaction exactly, but the particular expression of a long project finally arriving at a critical point. He knows who planned the job. He knows who's been moving the stolen gold, and he knows the name of the man at the top. Elena looked at him for a long time. "You've been investigating this," she said. "The robbery. On your own. For 2 years. Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "The 2 railroad guards who were killed," he said finally. "One of them was my brother-in-law, my sister's husband. She had 3 children, and he was the only thing keeping them from losing the house. He said it the way men say difficult things when they've had a long time to practice saying them. Contained, controlled, but with that particular quality of effort that reveals how much the containment costs. I went to the marshal. The marshal investigated for 4 months and came up with nothing. Either he was incompetent or he was paid to come up with nothing. I stopped being sure which one and started doing it myself. The fire shifted. A log cracked in the cook stove. Elena thought about her husband, who she had loved in the imprecise, slightly bewildered way of someone who married young and didn't know enough yet to ask the right questions. She thought about the 2 years of their marriage, the money that came and went without clear explanation, the trips he took that he described vaguely, and she didn't examine too closely because she didn't want to know what she suspected. She thought about Thomas being hung in the county yard while she stood outside the fence because they wouldn't let her in. "The man who planned the robbery," she said. "You know who it is." "I suspect who it is."
He met her eyes. Silas will confirm it when he's ready. He's being uncooperative. He's deciding whether he's more afraid of me or of the man he'd be naming. A thin pause. He's not there yet.
Elena stood up. She moved to the stove and poured herself a coffee because she needed something to do with her hands, and she stood there with the mug and looked out the small window at the mountain, white and gray and still, the pines dark against the snow. He said my name, she said. How does he know my name? He knows who Thomas Mercer's wife is. He would. Ronan was watching her from the table. He was trying to get your attention. He'll want to use you. Use me how? To get to me. He'll tell you a story, probably that I'm dangerous, that I brought you here to use you as leverage, that he's the victim of all this. Whatever angle he thinks will work. He said it without heat. He's smart, and he spent his whole life reading people and figuring out what they need to hear. Elena turned from the window. Is any of it true? He didn't flinch from it. I brought you here because you needed somewhere to go, and I needed someone to manage the cabin. That's the truth. Whether it's the only reason is something you'll have to decide for yourself. He held her gaze steadily. I didn't know who you were when I saw you in the square. I knew you were Thomas Mercer's widow, but I didn't know you specifically. And after 11 days, I think I know enough to say that using you as leverage wasn't ever part of it. She looked at him for a long time. He sat very still and let her look. You should have told me, she said. Yes, he said. I should have. No excuse. No further explanation. Just that. She drank her coffee. He waited. I'm not going to open the door, she said. Something shifted in his shoulders. Not quite relief, but adjacent. Whatever he says to you through the floor, Ronan said, you come to me first, before you decide anything. I'll consider it, she said, which was not a promise, and they both knew it, but he accepted it and stood and put on his coat for the trapline, and they didn't speak again until he returned that afternoon. It was an imperfect agreement between two imperfect people in an imperfect situation, and it would have to be enough. The mountain pressed close around the cabin, silent and white, holding its own secrets the way it always had. The days that followed took on a pattern that Elena hadn't anticipated, something that almost resembled ordinary life, except for the cellar. Ronan left before dawn. She managed the cabin, fire, provisions, small maintenance tasks that she invented or actually needed depending on the day. He returned around midday, ate, worked on equipment or wood for an hour, and by late afternoon they were usually at the table together, either in silence or in conversation that started carefully and expanded as the weeks went on. She learned things about him the way you learn things about a place, not all at once, but in accumulation, small details adding up to something like a picture. He had grown up in the mountains. Not these mountains specifically, but the same range further south, in a logging settlement that no longer existed because the timber had run out and the people had followed it. His father had died when Ronan was 19, and he'd spent his 20s working trap lines and taking whatever seasonal labor came available, railroad construction, mining support, freight hauling. And somewhere in all of that, he'd learned to read trails and weather and the specific body language of men who intended violence, which was knowledge that had served him well and cost him things he didn't fully enumerate. The prison sentence. He told her about it on a night when the wind was particularly bad, and they'd both given up on sleep early and were sitting by the fire with coffee. He'd been 26. A man in a freight camp had been beating a woman he was traveling with, and Ronan had intervened, and the intervention had escalated past what the law considered proportionate, and the man had not survived it. The judge had given him 2 years instead of life on account of the circumstances, and Ronan had served both years and come out with a more considered understanding of the line between justice and the law and where those two things separated from each other. He told this story without self-pity or particular pride, just information, offered evenly because she'd asked, and because after 3 weeks he'd decided she'd earned the asking. Do you regret it? She said. He thought about it. A real pause, not performative. I regret he didn't survive, not for his sake, because dead men can't be held to account. She understood that, intimately. She told him things too, eventually, about her father's farm, about marrying Thomas at 19 because he was charming and energetic, and represented a world that seemed larger than the one she'd grown up in, and because she'd been too young to know that energy without direction is just restlessness wearing an interesting face. About the 2 years of marriage that had been good in patches and confusing in others, and the moment she'd understood that she didn't fully know who she was living with, and the decision she'd made to understand it better, which Thomas had forestalled by getting arrested. He wasn't a bad man, she said one evening. She was darning a sock that had developed a hole. She'd found thread and a needle in a small sewing tin on the provisions shelf. He made terrible choices. He hurt people. But when it was just the two of us and the farm and no opportunities to make the choices he made, he was... She paused, moving the needle. He was trying to be better than what he came from. He just didn't have the patience for it. Ronan was across the table working on a trap mechanism that had bent out of alignment. He looked up at her. "You've spent a lot of time explaining him to people who didn't ask," he said. Not unkindly. She stopped darning. "The town assumed I knew." "I know. And everyone who ever met him assumed I was like him." "I know that too." He set down the trap. "You don't have to explain him to me." She looked at him. "You're here," he said simply. "That's the information I have. What you're here from is your business." She went back to the sock. Something in her chest had shifted. Not a large movement, but a real one. The particular sensation of a weight you've been carrying for so long that you've stopped noticing it, until the moment someone takes a small piece of it and the difference is suddenly obvious. The cellar was quiet for most of those weeks. Occasional scratching, the kind she'd begun to classify as the sound of someone shifting position against a wall. Twice she heard what might have been singing, low, tuneless, the sound of a man keeping himself company in the dark. Nothing more specific, nothing else with her name in it. She thought about that constantly, the restraint of it. A man who knew that saying her name had gotten a reaction, using the knowledge strategically, saving it. Calculating the right moment. Patient in the way people get patient when they have nothing else available. It made her careful. She understood at least why Ronan had told her to stay away from it. Not because he thought she was stupid or weak, but because Silas Crow was specifically dangerous to a person with her history, a person who'd been discarded and deceived, and might, under the right framing, be susceptible to the right kind of appeal. She was susceptible to it. She could admit that to herself. She wasn't above it. But she was also, by now, better at recognizing it than she'd been a year ago. The understanding between her and Ronan had shifted from the careful politeness of the first weeks into something that had more texture to it, more comfortable in some ways, more complicated in others. They disagreed sometimes. About methodology, she thought he was being too slow with Silas, too patient in waiting for a confession that might never come voluntarily. He thought she underestimated how much the man still feared the person above him in the chain. "People will endure almost anything," he said one afternoon, "if the alternative is something they're more afraid of." Then what changes it? When the equation shifts. He was at the window, looking at the snow. When the thing down there becomes worse than the thing out here. How do you make it worse down there? He glanced at her. "I don't. I wait." "That could take all winter." "It might." She made a frustrated sound. He didn't respond to it, which was its own form of response. He'd learned when her frustration was asking for a solution and when it was asking for acknowledgement, and he was getting better at telling the difference, which was more than most people she'd known had managed. The snow fell and fell. The wolves at the south tree line howled on clear nights with the easy confidence of creatures that owned the dark. The provisions held. The fire held. The trap line produced enough that Ronan could trade pelts at the relay station 12 miles west. A man named Garrison ran it, gruff and incurious, which were the qualities most valued at that altitude in winter, and maintained their supply chain without descending to Oak Ridge. 3 weeks in, Elena found the maps. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for a second candle because the one on the table was low, and she checked the small chest on the provisions shelf that she hadn't opened before. Inside, the candles were wrapped in oilskin alongside 3 folded papers that she unfolded before she'd thought clearly about whether she should. They were hand-drawn maps of the valley below. Oak Ridge was marked, and several other locations she recognized: the marshal's office, the bank, the Western Continental Depot, but also locations she didn't, marked in Ronan's tight, economical hand with annotations she had to puzzle over. A building north of town marked warehouse, JH. Another at the east edge marked storage. Confirmed. Lines connecting points, dates. She stood with the maps in both hands and looked at them for a long time. Then she refolded them exactly as she'd found them, placed them back under the candles, took one candle and closed the chest. That night at dinner she said, JH. He looked up from his food. On the map, she said, north of town, JH with a question mark. She held his gaze. Gerald Holt's middle name is Jerome. I heard him use it once, signing something at the county office. Ronan was very still. Jerome Holt, she said. The mayor. He set down his fork. You went through my chest, he said. I was looking for a candle. And then you went through the papers. She met his eyes and didn't apologize because apologizing would be dishonest. She'd looked and she didn't regret it. The man who exiled me, she said. The man who stood on that platform and counted my dead husband's crimes in front of half the territory. Her voice was steady, but just barely. He's the one who planned the robbery. Ronan picked up his fork again, set it down again, looked at the table. He organized it, he said quietly. Financed it through a shell company. Used his position to ensure the marshal's investigation went nowhere. He paused. The $40,000 from the robbery, most of it was moved within a month. A portion is still unaccounted for. In the cellar. Silas knows where. He won't talk because he's more afraid of Holt than of you. Yes. Elena sat with this for a moment. The fire shifted. The wind was low tonight, just a murmur at the edges of the cabin. He stood on that platform, she said again, not because Ronan hadn't heard her the first time, but because she needed to say it twice to fully feel the shape of it. He sentenced me to die in a snowbank. He knew the whole time that I had nothing to do with any of it. He likely considered you a loose end. A loose end. She repeated it flatly. Someone whose continued presence in the territory was an inconvenience, yes. Ronan watched her carefully. Elena, I'm not going to do anything impulsive. She heard the sharpness in her own voice. I'm angry. That's different. He was quiet for a moment, assessing. Good, he said finally. Stay angry. Anger is a better engine than grief. She looked at him. It was an odd thing to say, not comforting in any traditional sense, not softening the information or the feeling, just practical. Just true, actually. She ate the rest of her meal in silence. The anger sat in her chest like a coal, not burning uncontrolled, but hot and steady, giving off heat. She'd learned, in the past year, that grief exhausted her and rage galvanized her, and she wasn't sure what that said about her character, but she was past caring whether her reactions were the correct shape. Gerald Holt had destroyed her life while knowing she was innocent, and he was sitting down there in the valley, warm and fed and in authority, waiting for winter to do his work for him. She did not touch the cellar door, but for the first time since arriving at Stormcrest Peak, she was thinking very carefully about what happened when spring came. That night the wind came up suddenly from the northwest, the kind of wind that arrived without warning and had real intent to it. The cabin strained and creaked. A shutter on the outbuilding had come loose. She could hear it, a rhythmic crack against the wall. And she lay in bed listening to it and thinking about the maps and the warehouse marked JH, and the 6 men who had died at Dalton Pass, 2 of whom had left families behind. And beneath those thoughts, below the floor, below the rug, below the locked door, silence, patient silence, with a plan in it. She'd stopped hearing the scratching 2 nights ago. Silas Crow had gone quiet, and the quiet, she was realizing, was more dangerous than the sounds had been, because silence meant he was thinking too. She pulled the blanket tighter and looked at the ceiling and let the wind shake the cabin around her, and she thought about what Ronan had said. When the equation shifts, when the thing down there becomes worse than the thing out here. She thought about what it might take to change a man's equation. She didn't have an answer yet, but she was starting to ask the right questions, which was something. Outside the mountain pressed down with all its winter weight, enormous and indifferent, full of things that had nothing to do with the lives of the people living on its face. It had been here before them and would be here after, and it did not care what happened in the small warm spaces people carved out against its cold. But Elena was beginning to understand that indifference, in its own way, was a kind of freedom. The mountain didn't hate her, it didn't pity her, it simply was. And in being simply what it was,
It had no stake in her failure. That was more than she'd gotten from any town. She closed her eyes, and this time, finally, she slept.
3 days after she found the maps, Silas Crow started talking again.
She was alone. Ronan had left before dawn as usual, the sky still fully dark, and the temperature dropped to something that made the logs in the walls contract and tick like cooling metal. She'd built the fire up, made coffee, sat with a book she wasn't reading. The cabin was as quiet as it ever got, which wasn't completely quiet because the mountain always had something to say, but quiet enough that when the voice came through the floor, it arrived with the clarity of something that had been carefully timed. Mrs. Mercer. Not her first name this time. Formal, calculated. She sat with her coffee and looked at the rug by the east wall and did not move. "I know you can hear me." A pause. "I'm not going to beg. I've got too many miles on me for begging." Another pause, shorter. "But I think you're a woman who deserves to know the truth about her situation. And I think you're smart enough to know that the man upstairs, up here I mean, isn't giving you all of it." She set her coffee down very carefully, so it didn't make a sound against the table. "He brought you up here for a reason," Silas continued. His voice had a quality to it that she hadn't been able to assess fully through the floorboards before. Now she could. It was a storyteller's voice, warm at the edges, with a kind of practiced intimacy, the voice of a man who had spent years using sound as a tool. "You think it was charity. A man sees a woman in the mud, helps her out of it. That's a good story. People like that story." She stood up slowly. "The truth is he needed a face at that cabin, someone with a connection to the robbery. When the people he's working against come looking, and they will come looking, Mrs. Mercer, they always do. You're the decoy. You're what they see first." She crossed the room to the east wall, stepping around the table. She did not pull back the rug. She crouched beside it and put her hands flat on the floor, feeling the cold of the boards through her palms. "You sound very confident about that," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was mildly surprised. Silence. Then, "You're right there. I'm right here." Good. She could hear him shift, the scrape of movement against a hard floor, the sound of a man repositioning himself. He was directly below her, she calculated, maybe 8 feet down. "Then let me ask you something. How much has he told you about why I'm down here?" "Enough." "What's enough?" "You were the intermediary for the Dalton Pass job. You know who organized it. You won't say." "He told you that." A pause that had something thoughtful in it. "Did he tell you how he found me?" She said nothing. "I was at a mining camp in Redfield Range," Silas said. "Minding my own, hurting nobody. He came in with 2 other men. I didn't know him, didn't know his face, and they put a bag over my head and threw me across a horse." A pause. "Now, does that sound like a man building a legal case, or does that sound like a man who wants the money?" "It sounds like a man who couldn't get cooperation through official channels," she said, "which he already told me." Another silence, longer this time. "He told you about Garrison's relay station?" Silas asked. She had no idea what he meant by that, but she kept her face still on the chance that he could hear stillness as well as sound. "What about it?" 12 miles west. The man who runs it, Garrison. You think he's just trading in pelts?" A pause. "He's Blackwood's contact, federal marshal's office, operating off the books because the regular channels are compromised. Blackwood's been running evidence up through Garrison for 2 years, using the trapline as cover." Another pause. "What he hasn't told you is what happens when he's got enough evidence. He goes to the federal court in Denver. That gets announced. And everybody in that courtroom knows the name of the widow who was living at Stormcrest when the case broke, connected to the robbery by marriage, living with the man who built the case." The voice dropped slightly. "You become the story, Mrs. Mercer, whether you want to be or not. And in that story, you're either a witness or a suspect, and which one depends entirely on who tells it first." Elena sat back on her heels. She made herself think slowly, deliberately. This was what he did. This was exactly what Ronan had described. Take the true pieces, the ones she could verify. The relay station, Garrison, the federal case. Surround them with interpretation. Build a frame that made the true pieces look like evidence of the lie. She knew the technique. Thomas had used versions of it. Not on her, or not directly, but she'd watched him use it on other people. Take what's real. Arrange it to mean something different.
You know what I think? She said. What? I think you've had 5 weeks down there to build that argument, and it's the best one you could come up with. She stood up. Her knee ached from crouching. And I think if you were actually offering me freedom and answers, you would have led with the specifics, not the insinuations. A long pause. The gold, he said. And his voice had changed. The warmth had gone out of it, just slightly, just enough to reveal something harder underneath. $22,000, still where it was put in the first weeks after the job. I'm the only one who knows where. And you're offering it to me. I'm offering half of it to whoever gets me out of this cellar. That's a different offer than freedom and truth. I'm being direct now. You're being desperate now. She turned from the rug and walked back to the table. There's a difference. She sat down, picked up her coffee, which had gone cold, drank it anyway. From below, nothing more came. She'd closed something, at least temporarily, pushed past the frame he'd built to the thing underneath it, which was simple and frightened and trying not to show it. She felt the particular complicated satisfaction of having seen through something that was designed to be seen through only after it had worked. She also felt the thing he'd planted, the thing she couldn't just dismiss. You become the story. She sat with that for a while. When Ronan came back that afternoon, she told him everything. Not immediately. She waited until they'd eaten and the fire was settled and the day had given them both a few minutes to decompress from their respective mornings. Then she laid it out, as accurately as she could, the whole conversation in sequence. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat quiet for about 30 seconds, his coffee mug turning in his hands. The relay station, he said. He knew about Garrison. Yes. Which means someone told him, before he was taken. He set the mug down. He had people watching, or Holt did. Someone who knew enough about my operation to give Silas insurance before he went into hiding. Is what he said about the federal case true? He met her eyes directly. Which part? That I become part of the story. That my connection to the robbery by marriage puts me in the frame when the case goes to court. A pause. Not hesitation exactly. More like a man deciding how much credit someone deserved for the quality of their question. It's possible, he said. Depends on how the federal prosecutor handles it and what evidence exists to your lack of involvement. He paused. That's part of why clearing your name through the case matters. If we get Holt in front of a federal court and the full scope of the conspiracy is established, who planned it, who funded it, who the participants were, your absence from all of that becomes part of the official record. Part of why, she repeated. Yes. What's the other part? He looked at her. Because you didn't do anything. She held his gaze. In the weeks since arriving at Stormcrest, she'd gotten better at reading his face, which was a project because his expressions were economical to the point of near absence. But there was something in the way he held eye contact, unblinking, direct, with a quality of decision behind it, that she'd come to recognize as his version of emphasis. He meant it. All right, she said. You handled that well? He said. This morning. I almost went to the door, she admitted, but you didn't. The half you didn't say is that I wanted to. He almost smiled, just an almost, a slight movement at the corners of his mouth that pulled against the scar tissue on the left side and didn't quite complete itself. I know. That's what he was counting on. She picked up her book from the table, then put it down again because she couldn't read right now. Her mind was moving too fast for the fixed pace of pages. The 22,000, she said. He knows where it is. That's real, isn't it? That's not the constructed part. Almost certainly real. He'd need something concrete to offer. How long are you planning to wait for him to give it up voluntarily? Until he decides the math changes. Ronan stood and began clearing the table. Holt isn't sitting still down there. He has people. He'll start pushing when the trail gets cold, when he hasn't heard from Silas and he knows something's wrong. When that pressure builds to a certain point, Silas is going to have to choose which direction he's more afraid of. He looked at her over his shoulder. I'd like to be the direction he's less afraid of when that happens. She thought about that, about the pressure building below in the valley while the snow held everything still up here, about Holt pushing and the equation shifting just as Ronan had described. And if it happens fast, she said, if Holt sends someone up the mountain before Silas talks? Ronan turned back to the dishes. Then things get complicated. Which was, she was learning,
his way of saying he'd already planned for it, and the plan wasn't comfortable, and he'd rather she not know the details yet. She let it go. For the moment. What she could not let go, in the days that followed, was the cellar. Not the voice in it, that went quiet again after her refusal of his offer, Silas apparently reorganizing whatever he planned to try next. It was the door itself that occupied her. She moved around it every day, stepped over the rug that covered it, arranged her life in that room around the fixed point of the thing she wasn't supposed to approach. And every act of not approaching it was its own kind of approach. She was not a person who had ever done well with forbidden things. That had never been recklessness. It was something more considered than that. A genuine discomfort with information being withheld. Her father had done it constantly. The patriarchal certainty that knowing things would upset her, worry her, confuse her. Thomas had done it in his way too, the gentle misdirection of a man who loves someone and also has things to hide. She'd learned the shape of it early and developed a particular allergy to it that the years had not diminished. She trusted Ronan. That was new, and she didn't take it lightly. She was building it the way you build anything on a mountain, carefully, accounting for the ground beneath, knowing a foundation that looks solid can shift. But trust and permission were not the same thing. On the 28th day, she started keeping her own notes. She found a stub of pencil in the sewing tin and a piece of brown paper from the provisions wrapping, and at night after Ronan slept, she wrote down what she knew. The maps, the locations, the initials. Garrison and the relay station, what Silas had said and what she'd verified. The timeline Ronan had described, 2 years of investigation, the trail from Dalton Pass to Oak Ridge to here. She drew her own map from memory. Rougher than Ronan's, less precise, but complete enough to hold the shape of what she understood. She kept the paper folded inside her book, in the pages she'd already read, where it would look like nothing if found. She wasn't sure why exactly. Not because she didn't trust Ronan, she did. More because she'd spent 6 months having no information and no agency and no understanding of the situation she was in, and the act of writing it down felt like reclaiming something. Like she was no longer just a person things were happening to, but a person assembling a picture. It felt important. The cold that week was different from the cold before. Deeper, more settled, the kind that arrived in December in the high country and announced its intention to stay until it decided otherwise. Ronan said the temperature at night was dropping past what his thermometer measured, which stopped at 15 below. She believed him. The water in the basin by the stove had frozen solid one morning before she'd gotten the fire fully up, and it had taken 30 minutes of steady heat to make it usable again. They moved around each other in the small cabin with the careful choreography of two people who had gradually figured out how not to be constantly in each other's way. He took the right side of the stove area. She took the left. He did the heavier outdoor work, wood, horses, anything that required sustained strength in the cold. She managed the interior, the cooking, the provisions tracking, which she'd taken over formally 3 weeks in because she was better at it. It wasn't a comfortable arrangement in any soft or domestic sense. They were not gentle with each other, exactly. They were direct, sometimes blunt, occasionally in the specific low-grade friction of two people with strong views sharing a small space. They disagreed about risk and disagreed about timing, and once had a genuinely sharp argument about whether she should be left alone on the mountain if he needed to make an overnight run to Garrison Station. "I've managed the cabin alone for days at a time," she said, "not with him in the cellar actively trying to work on you. I handled him fine." "You handled him well once. That doesn't mean—" "Don't do that." Her voice had an edge that surprised even her. "Don't make the decision and then explain it to me like it's for my benefit. Tell me you don't want to leave because you don't want to leave. That I can respect. The other thing I've heard too many times from men who thought they knew my limits better than I did." He stopped. She held his gaze, held it past the point of comfort. "I don't want to leave," he said, "because I don't trust him. And the situation is unstable, and if something goes wrong, I need to be here." He paused. "That's the reason. It's not about your capability." "All right," she said. "That's a different thing." "Yes." "Then say that." He nodded. Once. The nod of a man storing information about how to do better next time, which was, she was finding, one of the things about him that was difficult to stay angry at. The argument dissolved, the way their friction always did. Not dramatically, not with apologies or gestures, just a gradual return to the work of being alive in a cold place.
She went back to the provisions inventory. He went back to the trapline maintenance. By evening, they were at the table eating in the particular silence that wasn't uncomfortable anymore. The shift happened on a Thursday. She was at the cook stove with her back to the room when she heard it. Not from the cellar this time, but from outside. Distant, carried on the mountain wind in a way that made it difficult to locate precisely. A horse. Maybe two. She crossed to the window without thinking and looked out, and Ronan was already on his feet from the cot, already at the second window, his body angled in the way she'd learned to read as high alert without visible panic. "How many?" she said. "Can't see yet." He was pulling on his boots. "East approach. Below the ridge. Could be Garrison. Garrison always comes from the west." He reached for the rifle above the door. She'd noted where it was on day one, because she noted where all the weapons were, always. It was something Thomas had taught her without meaning to by being the kind of man who made such knowledge feel necessary. "Get to the back of the bedroom. Stay low." "What are—" Elena. The way he said her name, not sharp, but with a particular weight. "Please." She went. She went because please was not a word he used without reason, and because the quality of his attention at that window was not the attention of a man dealing with something ordinary. She went to the bedroom. She did not go to the back of it. She crouched beside the door frame where she could see the main room and most of the front wall. Ronan was at the window. Still. Then he moved, fast, back from the glass, and she understood a half-second later why when the sound reached her. Not a horse. A voice. Calling up from below the ridge, far away still but moving closer, calling Ronan's name. He turned from the window and looked at her across the room. Something had changed in his face. Something that she hadn't seen there before and spent a fraction of a second trying to identify. It was the look of a man whose timeline has just been moved. "How far?" she said. 20 minutes if they're pushing." He was moving, pulling things from the shelf. Ammunition, the smaller handgun she'd seen him clean but never carry, something wrapped in oilskin that went inside his coat. "Maybe less." "How many?" "3 that I can hear. Could be more behind the ridge." "Holt's men." He didn't answer that, which was its own answer. She looked at the cellar door, the rug over it, the locked thing underneath. "Silas," she said, "stays where he is. If they're here for him, they're here for me." His voice was flat. "Silas is insurance. They'll take him if they find him, but he's not the primary objective." He checked the rifle, checked it again. "Holt wants the evidence. Everything I've sent to Garrison, everything I've built. If he can discredit it before it reaches Denver, the case dies. And you with it," she said. He looked at her. "Don't make a face like that's not what you mean," she said. "It's one possibility. It's the main one." She stood from the doorframe and came into the room. Her heart was moving fast. She could feel it, not pleasantly, a heavy and insistent beat. "What do I do?" He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than the situation strictly allowed. "There's a second rifle," he said, "wrapped in canvas under the bed. It's loaded, it's accurate to 200 yards, and it kicks hard on the right shoulder, so plant your left foot and lean into it." He held her eyes. "That's for emergency only. I want you to understand that." "What counts as emergency?" "Me being unable to handle it myself." She nodded. He went to the door, stopped with his hand on it. "Elena." He didn't turn around. "Whatever happens, Garrison has a copy of everything. The case doesn't die if I do. You understand that?" She understood it. She also understood it was the closest he'd come to an admission that the next 20 minutes had a version where things went very badly. "Come back in one piece," she said. "I mean that practically, not sentimentally." He pushed open the door and went out into the cold. She watched him go from the window. He moved across the snow toward the east ridge, not running, not crouching, just walking with that particular purposeful economy, like a man going to do a job he's been preparing for. The mountain wind came up from below, carrying the sound of horses getting closer. Elena went to the bedroom. She pulled the canvas-wrapped rifle from under the bed and unwrapped it, and checked it the way her father had taught her to check a rifle when she was 12 years old, that being one of the few useful things he'd offered. Then she went back to the doorframe and waited. Below, in the cellar, she heard Silas Crow begin to move. The moving in the cellar was rhythmic and purposeful. Not the shifting of a restless man, but something with intent behind it. Silas had heard the horses too. Elena stayed at the doorframe with the rifle and listened to both things at once. The approaching sound from outside, which had resolved itself into the creak of saddle leather and the particular muffled impact of hooves in packed snow, and the sounds from below, which were now unmistakably the sounds of a man trying to work himself into a specific position. She thought about what that meant. If Holt's men were coming for Silas, Silas knew it. And a man who hears his rescuers approaching is going to do whatever he can to make himself findable. She crossed the room, stepped around the rug without touching it, and crouched by the east wall. "Don't," she said, low and flat, directly at the floor. The sounds below stopped. "They're not here for you," she said. "They're here to clean up. You understand what that means?" Silence. "You're a loose end, Silas. Same as I was." She kept her voice level. "The difference is I'm the only thing standing between you and those men figuring out where you are." A very long pause. Then, from below, quietly, "What do you want? Stay quiet. Don't move. Don't make a sound." She stood and went back to the window. Ronan had reached the east ridge. She could see him, a dark shape against the white, positioned where the rock outcropping gave him cover and a clear sightline down the approach trail. He was still, just waiting. 3 riders came up over the lower ridgeline. She recognized one of them immediately, even at this distance, because she'd spent 6 months watching him from across a town square, and the shape of a man on a horse is as distinct as his face if you've studied him long enough. Mayor Gerald Holt rode in the center, his coat too good for the mountain, his horse too clean for the trail they'd climbed. He sat stiffly, the way men sit when they're accustomed to carriages and regard horses as a necessary inconvenience. The 2 men flanking him were different, working men or men who did the kind of work that doesn't get named directly. They rode with ease, and their hands were positioned with the casual readiness of people who'd had occasion to need their hands quickly before. Ronan stepped out from the rock. Elena pressed closer to the window. She couldn't hear the words. The glass was thick, and the wind was working against her. But she could read the shape of the conversation. Ronan's posture, contained, still, the rifle at his side not raised but not slung either. Holt speaking, the broad gestures of a man accustomed to pronouncing. The 2 flanking riders not speaking, just watching Ronan with the specific attention of men measuring distance and angles. Then Holt stopped speaking and one of the flanking men moved his hand. Elena didn't think. She was already at the door. The cold hit her like a wall when she opened it. Deep, serious cold that entered through every gap in her clothing instantly, but she was moving and cold was a problem for later. She came around the side of the cabin and crouched at the corner, the rifle up. The rider who'd moved his hand had his gun halfway out. Ronan had seen it. He was already pivoting, bringing his own rifle up, but the angle was wrong, the second rider moving to his blind side while he tracked the first. Elena put the stock against her shoulder, planted her left foot the way she'd been told, and found the second rider in the sight. "Don't," she said, loudly enough to carry. Everyone stopped. The second rider looked at her. He was maybe 40 feet away, and he had the kind of face that had made a lot of calculations under pressure. And she watched him make this one. The window of frozen movement would close in about 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds he was deciding whether the woman at the corner of the cabin was a real variable or a performance. She kept the sight on him and kept her face still and let him decide. He let his hand fall away from his coat. Holt turned on his horse and saw her. Something moved across his expression. Surprise first, then a rapid reassessment, and then a careful blankness that was its own kind of tell. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. He said it the way he'd said her name in the square, like reading from a list. "Mayor." She didn't lower the rifle. "You've ridden a long way from your town. I'm following up on a matter of county concern." He'd recovered his composure with the speed of a man who'd survived difficult situations by keeping his voice measured. "There's a fugitive believed to be in this area, a dangerous man. I have a civic obligation." "You have a civic obligation." She repeated it without inflection. "That's correct. The same civic obligation that put me on my knees in the mud." She kept the rifle level. "The same one that sentenced me to die in a snowbank knowing I'd never done anything wrong." A silence. The wind moved between them. Now's not the time for...
I know who you are, she said. I know what you did. I know how the Dalton Pass job was funded, and who gave the orders, and who made sure the marshal's investigation found nothing. She watched his face. The blankness held, but something underneath it was shifting, the subtle wrongness of a carefully maintained surface under pressure. I know about the warehouse north of town. I know about the gold. Holt looked at Ronan. Ronan said nothing. He was watching the two riders. You've been busy up here, Holt said. His voice had changed. The civic warmth had gone out of it entirely. What was left was what had always been underneath, something flat and practical and without particular feeling about what it was willing to do. Both of you. The evidence is already in Denver, Ronan said. It was the first thing he'd said since Elena had come around the corner. You're a month late, Gerald. The name landed with a particular weight, not Mayer, not Mr. Holt. The use of it said something about what Ronan thought the power structure between them actually was now. Holt's jaw tightened. Evidence built by a convicted criminal acting outside any legal authority is corroborated by a federal marshal's agent who's been operating in this territory for 18 months. Ronan's voice was even. Garrison sends his regards. The silence that followed was a different quality from the one before. Holt's horse shifted under him, picking up something from its rider, and Holt steadied it with a hand that was not quite steady. Elena watched his eyes. She'd learned in the months of being judged by this man in his town to watch people's eyes when they were running out of options. There was a specific moment. She'd seen it in the square when Ronan had offered to pay her debt, a flash of recalculation before Holt's face reassembled, where a person decides they have nothing left to lose. She saw it now. Take them, Holt said. The rider to his left moved first, faster than she'd expected, already off the horse and angled toward Ronan before the words were fully out. The rider to his right wheeled his horse toward her. She didn't fire at the rider coming toward her. She moved, back around the corner of the cabin, using the log wall, putting it between her and the horse. The animal was too big and too fast in the open, and she was on foot and the math was bad. She heard the horse pull up short at the corner, the rider hauling on the reins because you can't take a horse around a blind corner at speed if you don't know what's on the other side. She came around the other corner. Behind her she heard the shot, Ronan's rifle, one crack, and then a second shot that wasn't his, and then the sound of a man hitting the ground. She cleared the back of the cabin and came up the far side, and the rider who'd been coming around for her had stopped because he'd heard the shots and was repositioning, and she had a clear angle for about half a second. She took it. The rifle kicked exactly as Ronan had described. Hard right, demanding the left foot and the lean, and she'd done both. And the shot was high but close enough that the rider threw himself flat against his horse's neck, and the horse shied sideways into a snowbank and went down. She was already moving again. Around the front of the cabin, Ronan was on one knee in the snow. The first rider was down, not moving. Holt was still on his horse, and he had something in his hand, not a gun, something she hadn't registered at first because it was small and cylindrical and dark. She understood what it was a fraction of a second before he lit it. Dynamite. A single stick, short fuse, already sparking in his gloved hand. Ronan had seen it too. She could tell by the way he'd stopped, the specific paralysis of a man calculating whether he can make the shot before the throw and understanding that he cannot, because Holt was already bringing his arm back. Elena raised the rifle. Her shoulder was burning from the first shot. Her hands were cold in a way that made fine muscle control a genuine question. The wind was coming from the north, and she hadn't accounted for it the first time. And she had to now, a fast and imprecise mental adjustment, and she had maybe 1 second before the stick left Holt's hand. She breathed out. She found him in the sight. She thought about the square, about frozen mud, about the specific look on his face when he'd read her debt from that paper, the satisfaction of a man exercising power he'd built on top of other people's ruin. She pulled the trigger. The shot struck his right arm, not where she'd aimed for his shoulder, but the wind correction had been slightly off, and the bullet hit lower, and his arm dropped and the dynamite dropped with it, falling from his hand into the snow at his horse's feet. It detonated. Not the catastrophic explosion of a full charge, but more than enough. A sharp concussive bang, a spray of snow and frozen dirt, and Holt's horse rearing violently and throwing him sideways. He hit the ground hard, the horse bolting east down the trail,
and he lay there for a moment, not moving. Elena lowered the rifle. Her ears were ringing. Ronan was getting to his feet. Slowly. Too slowly. And she saw why when she reached him, his left side, just below the ribs, where his coat was dark in a way that wasn't the fabric. "You're hit," she said. Grazed. He straightened fully. It cost him something. First rider got one off before I did. That's not a graze. It's not deep enough to be anything worse. He looked at Holt, who was sitting up now in the snow, his right arm held against his chest, his face the color of something kept too long from sunlight. "You hit his arm." "I was aiming for his shoulder." Wind came up. "I know." She looked at her hands, which were shaking now that the moment had passed. She'd noticed this about herself before. She held together fine during the thing and fell apart a little bit after, which Thomas had once called convenient and she had once called human. "Where's the other rider? The one I shot at?" "Down the south side with his horse. He's not coming back up." Ronan looked at her hands, looked at her face. "You all right?" "Ask me in an hour." She looked at Holt. "What do we do with him?" Holt had gotten to his feet, or most of the way to his feet. He was listing, the arm bad, the fall having done something to his hip that was making him favor his left side. He looked at them both with an expression that had shed everything but a kind of exhausted calculation. "You have nothing that holds in a court," he said. His voice was ragged, but the certainty in it was still there, the bedrock certainty of a man who had been the largest person in every room for 30 years. A convicted man's testimony, an off-book federal contact, a widow with a motive, and a signed confession, Ronan said. Holt stopped. Silas Crow signed a full statement 6 days ago. Ronan's voice was even, almost conversational. It took a while. He's a cautious man. But when the wind shifted, he glanced at Elena briefly, a half-second acknowledgement of whose conversation with Silas had changed something. He decided he'd rather face a federal court than whatever you were planning to send up the mountain. The color left Holt's face entirely. Elena watched him and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not the hot satisfaction she'd anticipated from this moment when she'd imagined it at night. Something quieter. Something that was mostly just the ending of a tension that had been living in her chest for so long she'd stopped noticing it was there. "The gold," she said. "Where Silas told you to look." Ronan nodded. "Recovered 2 weeks ago. Marshal's office in Denver has it." She looked at Holt. "You left me to die in a snowbank for money you'd already lost." He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The wind came down off the mountain, cold and indifferent, scattering the fine surface snow across the ground between them. They secured Holt with rope from the outbuilding. Ronan did the tying with his good arm while Elena watched both approaches with the rifle, because the second rider being down a slope didn't mean he'd stay there. Then Ronan sat heavily on the cabin steps and let her look at his side. It was worse than a graze. Not life-threatening. She'd seen enough by now to make that distinction. But a genuine wound, a furrow through muscle tissue that was bleeding steadily and would need proper attention. She packed it with cloth from inside and tied it as tightly as she could manage, which he endured with the specific stoic discomfort of a man who finds being helped physically harder than being hurt. "You're going to need a doctor," she said. "Garrison Station has a medical kit." "Garrison is 12 miles away and you're bleeding." "I've been worse." She looked at him directly. "I don't doubt that. You're still going to need a doctor." He looked back at her, and in the cold afternoon light with his coat dark at the side and snow in his hair, something in his expression was different from any version of his face she'd seen before. Less contained. Something that happened when the structure a person holds themselves together with gets temporarily loosened by pain and cold, and the particular aftermath of having nearly been blown up. "Thank you," he said, simply. She tied off the bandage. "That was a good shot," he said. "In the wind. With a cold weapon. It was low. It worked." She stood up, her knees aching from crouching in the snow. She looked at Holt, trussed and sitting against the outbuilding wall with his bad arm held carefully and his hat gone somewhere in the snow, looking diminished in the way powerful men look when the context that made them powerful is removed. She looked at the cabin, the closed door, the cellar beneath it where Silas Crow was still keeping quiet and doing it voluntarily now, which was its own measure of how things had changed. She looked at the mountain range behind them,
ridge after ridge, disappearing into the low winter sky, enormous and permanent and utterly uninterested in any of this.
Her shoulder hurt badly from the rifle kick. Her knee hurt from crouching. Her hands had stopped shaking, but only because they were too cold to manage it anymore. She was 24 years old, and she had just shot a dynamite stick out of a corrupt mayor's hand in the snow on a mountain. And the man who deserved to answer for 6 deaths and 40,000 stolen dollars and 1 widow condemned to freeze was sitting against a wall with a rope around his wrists. It wasn't clean. It wasn't how it happened in stories, where the moment of victory had a certain sound and light to it, a clarity you could recognize. It was just cold and quiet and done. For now, that was enough. The night after the shooting was the longest of Elena's life, and she'd had some long ones. Ronan's wound had stopped bleeding by midnight, which was the best news available. The bad news was everything else. The dead rider in the snow 20 yards from the cabin, Holt trussed against the outbuilding wall with 2 blankets she'd grudgingly given him, because letting him freeze to death was not something she was willing to add to the account. And the second rider who'd gone down the south slope and hadn't come back, which meant he was either dead, injured, or riding hard for Oak Ridge to report back to whoever Holt had left in charge. She stayed up. Ronan had argued against it and lost, which she was fairly certain was a first. She'd told him flatly that he'd lost blood and needed sleep more than she did, and that she was capable of watching a door and a window simultaneously without his supervision. And after a moment, he'd accepted this with the particular grace of a man who knows when an argument is structurally unwinnable and chooses his battles accordingly. He slept on the cot with his rifle beside him. She sat at the table with hers across her knees and watched the window and listened to the mountain. Silas Crow didn't make a sound all night. She'd unlocked the cellar after securing Holt. Ronan had given her the key without being asked, which meant something, though she hadn't paused to examine what. And she'd opened the hatch 3 inches and told Silas what had happened, and that he needed to stay put until morning. He'd said nothing immediately, and then he'd said quietly, "The arm shot. That was you?" And she'd said yes. And he'd been quiet for another moment and then said, "All right." And that had been the end of it. She sat through the dark hours and thought about a lot of things. She thought about the second rider and whether he'd reach Oak Ridge and who he'd talk to and how long they had before the situation required something more than 2 rifles and a wounded man. She thought about Garrison and whether the relay station had any way to move faster than a man on a horse, and decided it probably didn't. She thought about Denver and the federal courthouse there, and the documents Ronan had been building for 2 years that were sitting in someone's office right now, already past the point where Holt could reach them. She thought about what it meant that it was already past that point, that the worst had happened and hadn't been enough, that the evidence survived the man who made it and the cabin survived the dynamite, and she was still sitting at this table and Holt was still breathing against the outbuilding wall. She'd expected, if she was honest, to feel more. The moment in the snow when the dynamite went off and Holt went down. She'd felt something, but not the catharsis she'd been building in her imagination for months. More like the release of a pressure she'd been holding so long she'd confused it for part of herself. She wasn't sure what to do with that yet. Around 4 in the morning, the wind changed direction and brought snow with it, light and horizontal, the kind that didn't accumulate fast but made the world past the window disappear into gray-white static. She watched it and thought about Oak Ridge, which was down there somewhere below all of it, going about its pre-dawn business with no knowledge of what had happened on the mountain above. She wondered how the town would take the news. Not with joy on her behalf. She wasn't naive enough to expect that. Collective guilt didn't tend to announce itself, in her experience. What happened more often was a reorganization of the story, a gradual revision of what people remembered thinking and doing, until the consensus became that everyone had always suspected Holt, always had doubts, always treated that Mercer woman with basic decency even if a few others hadn't. She was angry about that in advance. And then she was tired of being angry in advance about things that hadn't happened yet, and she looked at the window and drank cold coffee and let it go. At 6 in the morning, Ronan woke up on his own, which she'd expected. 4 hours was apparently what he'd meant about his sleep. He came to the table and looked at her and looked at the window and looked at his wound, which she'd checked it too and found holding. "No movement," she said. "Wind changed at 4, snow since then." He nodded. The South Rider. "Either dead in the snow or most of the way to Oak Ridge by now." She set her coffee down. "We need to move faster than whatever he sets in motion." "Garrison." He was already thinking it. If I can get to him today, you can't ride 12 miles with that wound. I can. You'll reopen it halfway there and bleed out in the snow. She met his eyes. I'll go. He looked at her. I know the trail, she said. You've taken me partway twice. I have the rest of it from your description. I can find the station, I can tell Garrison what happened, and I can be back by nightfall if the snow stays light. She paused. Or you can ride there yourself, and I can deal with whatever shows up at this cabin alone. Pick one. He picked one. It took him about 30 seconds, which was faster than she'd expected. Garrison is short, gray-beard, unfriendly, he said. He'll want the details in order. Give them to him in order. What happened? Who was involved? How long ago? What condition Holt is in? He'll know what to do from there. He looked at her. Tell him I said the case is ready to close. He'll understand that. The case is ready to close, she repeated. Yes. She started getting her coat. Elena. He said her name the way he occasionally did, without anything ornamental attached to it, just the name, but with a quality of intention that made it something more than identification. She looked at him. Be careful, he said. I know how to ride in snow. I know you do. A pause. I meant generally. She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in his expression that they'd been circling for weeks, both of them aware of it, neither of them interested in the kind of scene where it got named directly. He was not a man built for that kind of scene, and she was not in a place yet where she fully trusted her own read on things. But it was there, real and mutual, and neither of them were pretending otherwise. I'll be back by dark, she said. She went out into the snow. The ride to Garrison Station was 12 miles of mountain trail in low visibility, and it took her 4 hours, which was longer than Ronan made it in and shorter than she'd feared she would. The trail held because the snow was light and hadn't drifted yet, but twice she lost the track and had to circle back, and once the horse spooked at something in the trees to the east that she never saw, and she spent 10 minutes convincing it to move again while the snow came down around them. Garrison Station was a low structure against the side of a ridge, almost invisible until she was 50 yards from it, which she suspected was intentional. A light in the window, smoke from the chimney. The man who answered the door was short and gray-bearded, and looked at her with the specific unfriendliness of someone who had arranged his life to see as few people as possible. Garrison, she said. Who's asking? Elena Mercer. I'm at Stormcrest with Ronan Blackwood. Ronan says the case is ready to close. He looked at her for a long moment in the way of a man running a verification in his head. Then he opened the door wider and stepped aside. She gave him the details in order, the way Ronan had told her to. What had happened, who was involved, how long ago. Holt's current condition, the second rider. Garrison listened without interrupting, which was the most focused attention she'd received from anyone in a long time. When she finished, he asked 3 questions, all of them specific and practical, and she answered them as accurately as she could. Then he picked up a receiver on a device on the wall, a telegraph line she hadn't expected this far from anywhere, and began sending. Federal Marshal's office in Denver, he said, without looking up. They've been waiting for this. He kept working the key. There's a contingent already staged in Mill Haven, 30 miles from Oak Ridge. They've been ready to move for 6 weeks. Blackwood's been feeding information for months. Today's the day it gets used. He paused in his sending. Your testimony will be needed. You understand that? Yes. It'll be unpleasant. They'll try to establish your connection to the robbery through your husband. Let them try. He glanced at her then, just briefly, a reassessment, and went back to the telegraph. 2 hours? He said. Maybe 3. The marshal's men will go to Oak Ridge first and then come up the mountain for Holt. He paused again. The man who went down your south slope. He reached Mill Haven an hour before you got here. The marshal already has him. She stared at him. How do you know that? Because the marshal telegraphed me 20 minutes before you knocked. He kept his eyes on the device. They were moving anyway. You just confirmed the location. She sat with that for a moment. The machine she'd been watching anxiously for months, the slow accumulation of evidence, the building of a case, the waiting, had already been in motion at a pace she couldn't see from the mountain. The pieces had been moving without her awareness, the way large things move when you're too close to them to see the shape. Ronan had known this. He'd been feeding it for 2 years. She thought about him alone at the cabin with a wounded side and Holt in the yard and the snow coming down, and she stood up. Thank you, she said. Garrison waved a hand without looking at her. She was already at the door. The ride back was faster. Urgency changes how you read a trail. She reached the cabin with 2 hours of gray light left in the sky and found it standing and quiet and exactly as she'd left it, which she'd been more worried about than she'd admitted to herself during the ride. Holt was still against the outbuilding wall, awake and miserable. The dead man in the snow was still there, covered now in a few inches of new snowfall. The cellar was still locked. Ronan was at the table, which she noticed he'd moved slightly so it gave him a sightline to both windows, a detail that was so characteristically him that it almost made her smile. He looked up when she came in. "Garrison sent to Denver," she said, getting her coat off. "Marshall's men were already staged in Mill Haven. They're moving to Oak Ridge first, then here. 2 to 3 hours," he said, but that was 2 hours ago. He let out a slow breath. Not dramatic, just the particular exhale of a man releasing tension he's carried for a very long time. "The second rider is in custody," she added. "They already had him." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "Good." She sat down. Her legs were tired from the ride. Her shoulders still ached from yesterday. "It's almost done," she said. "Almost," he agreed. They sat with that for a while. The fire was good. He'd kept it going, she noticed, which meant he'd been moving around in spite of the wound, which she decided not to comment on because the situation was nearly resolved and fighting about it now seemed like a waste of energy. "The position in Denver," she said. "Garrison mentioned it when I was leaving." Ronan looked at her. "He said the marshal's office has been trying to formally recruit you for 2 years. That this case closes with your name on it, there'll be an offer." She met his eyes. "A good one." "Garrison talks too much." He said 4 sentences. That was one of them. She kept her gaze on him. "Are you going to take it?" He looked at the table, at his hands, the left one with the badly healed fingers. "No," he said. "Why not?" "Because I'm not a man who does well with organizations." He looked up. "I did this one thing because it needed doing and I was the one in position to do it. That's different from being the kind of man who works within systems." A pause. "I know the difference. Took me a while, but I know it." She nodded slowly. "What will you do?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "What I've been doing, the mountain, the line." A pause that had a question in it. "You?" She looked at the window. The snow had stopped sometime in the last hour. Outside it was blue-gray and still, the last of the light going flat and diffuse across the white. What would she do? She had $41.60 of debt cleared. She had, pending whatever the federal court decided, a clean name or as close to one as she was going to get. She had 112 pounds of body weight that had been 130, and her left boot still let in water. And she knew how to read a mountain trail in low visibility and manage a cast iron stove and identify when a man was building an argument from true pieces arranged to mean a false thing. She had more than she'd had in the square at Oak Ridge. That was something. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I spent 6 months not thinking past the next week because the next week was genuinely uncertain. I'm not sure I know how to think further than that." He nodded, like that made sense, like it was a reasonable answer, not a failure of planning. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said. "I know." "Or tomorrow." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Stop being careful with me." "I'm not being—" "You are. You've been doing it for a week since the cellar conversation. You're managing the distance." She said it without accusation, just observation. "I notice things. It's a problem I've always had." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to be another thing that happened to you," he said. It came out slightly rough, like it had been held a while. "You've had enough of those." She looked at him for a long time. "There's a difference," she said, "between something happening to a person and a person choosing something." She paused. "I've had most of my choices made for me for a long time. I'd like to be the one making this one, if that's all right." He met her eyes. "All right," he said. The marshal's men arrived 90 minutes later, 4 of them, federal badges, the particular organized efficiency of people who'd been briefed and knew exactly what they were walking into. They took Holt into custody without ceremony. They recovered the dead rider. They went to the cellar for Silas Crow, who came up the stairs blinking in the dim light of the main room, thinner than he'd started, with the particular look of a man who has made his peace with the decision that cost him considerably. He looked at Elena when he emerged. She looked back at him. "You were right," he said, "about what they'd have done with me. I know. I wasn't wrong about everything else either. Some of it," she said, "not most of it." He accepted that with a slight nod, which was all there was to say about it, and the marshal's men took him out. The lead marshal, a lean man named Carew, who had the unhurried manner of someone who'd seen enough that surprises had become logistical problems rather than emotional events, took their statements at the table. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers. When Elena described the events of the previous day, the sequence of the confrontation and the shot, he wrote it down with no visible judgment about a woman having fired the weapon that ended the encounter. Before he left, he told her directly, "Your name is going to be cleared formally by the federal court in Denver within 30 days. The evidence of your non-involvement is in Crow's statement and in Blackwood's documentation. You'll need to appear in person, but it'll be a formality." He paused. "The reward for information leading to the recovery of the Dalton Pass gold comes out to $412. Your portion for providing material assistance is 1/3. He set a paper on the table. "Sign that when you're ready." She looked at the paper. 1/3 of $412 was more money than she'd had in her hands at one time in her entire life. More than her father had ever paid a year of labor. More than the debts Ronan had cleared in the square 3 times over. She picked up the pen. After the marshals left, taking Holt and Silas and the body of the dead rider and the noise and the structured urgency of official business with them, the cabin was very quiet. Ronan sat on the step outside and she sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders were an inch apart in the cold air. The sky had cleared in the past hour, and the stars over the mountain were extraordinary in the way that high-altitude winter stars are extraordinary. Not romantic exactly, more like a statement of scale that puts human concerns in their actual proportion. She sat with that for a while. "My sister's children," she said. "You said your brother-in-law was killed at Dalton. 3 kids." "Yes." "They'll get the compensation from the railroad settlement now, part of the case." "Yes." She nodded. There was something in that, not comfort exactly, but something more structural. The difference between a wound that heals and one that just stays open. You couldn't give back what was taken, but you could sometimes make a thing that meant the taking hadn't been entirely free. "It doesn't fix it," she said. "No." He looked at the stars. "It doesn't fix it, but the people responsible are going to answer for it. That matters. Not the same thing, but it matters." She thought about Thomas, about whether he'd known, when he took that job, how many people it would kill, whether he'd told himself it was a train robbery, not a murder, right up until the guards died. She thought about the particular human capacity for compartmentalization, the way people build walls inside themselves between what they're doing and what it means. She didn't know the answer. She'd stopped expecting to get one. "I'm going to go to Denver," she said, "for the court date, and after that—" She paused. "I think I'm going to find out what's there." Ronan was quiet. "I've never been to a city," she said. "I've never been anywhere except the farm in Oak Ridge. There's probably something embarrassing about that." "There isn't. I'm 24, I'm starting over." She said it plainly, without self-pity and without false brightness. It was just a fact. Like weather. I might as well start somewhere I haven't already failed. He turned his head and looked at her. The scar pulled slightly at his left expression, giving him that perpetual ambiguity she'd spent weeks learning to read past. "You didn't fail here," he said. "I know that." She met his eyes. "I meant the other place." A pause. "Denver's not small," he said. "No. Nothing familiar about it." "That's mostly the point." He looked back at the stars. She watched the side of his face. "I come down from the mountain in spring," he said, with the careful cadence of a man choosing words precisely, "to trade the winter pelts. Denver's on the way, more or less." She let that sit for a moment. "More or less," she said. "There are longer routes." "And shorter ones." "Yes." She looked out at the mountain range, peak after peak disappearing into the dark, enormous and silent, and completely indifferent to what 2 people said to each other on a cabin step. The cold had settled deep now that the wind was gone. Her breath made small clouds. Spring is a few months, she said. Give or take. That's a reasonable amount of time. I think so. She almost smiled. Not quite. But the almost was real, and it had been a long time since anything in the almost smile category had been real. They sat together on the step a while longer, not talking, the way people sit when the talking has found a natural place to rest, and neither one wants to disturb it. The cabin behind them was warm, the fire she'd built before the marshals arrived, still doing its work. The cellar was empty, the door standing open now, with no reason left to lock it. The provisions shelf held enough for 2 months. The woodpile was good. The horses were fed. She had $137 coming from the federal court. She had a name that was going to be clean. She had somewhere in the accumulated weeks of fire tending and map reading and arguments about risk and slow, careful conversations across a table, something she hadn't thought she was building, a sense of what she actually was, separate from who she'd been married to and what the town had decided about it. She wasn't soft. She'd never been particularly soft, and the year had finished the job on whatever softness remained. She was practical and suspicious and slow to trust, and occasionally sharp in ways that weren't always necessary, and she made notes on brown paper and hid them in her books, and couldn't leave a locked door alone. And she was just beginning to understand that these were not flaws to apologize for, but tools she'd built from necessity that were going to serve her well going forward. The mountain had tested her. Not in the meaningful, narrative way that mountains test people in stories, just in the simple, physical, relentless way that hard things test people by being hard. Cold, isolation, fear, the specific difficulty of trusting someone when your trust has been used poorly before. She hadn't passed every test. She'd been wrong about some things, and stubborn about others, and scared in ways she hadn't admitted out loud. She'd held together when it mattered and fallen apart a little when it didn't, which was perhaps as good a ratio as anyone could reasonably achieve. She thought about the girl who'd knelt in the mud in the square at Oak Ridge, searching the crowd for one face willing to acknowledge what was happening. She thought about what she'd have told that girl, if she could. Not that it would be fine, not that it would be easy, not any of the things people say when they want to make a difficult truth sound like a gift. Just get up, keep getting up. The number of times you get back up is the only count that matters. 4 times in the mud. She'd tried 4 times before she made it. It turned out that was enough. Ronan shifted slightly beside her, adjusting, she suspected, to his wound, which had to be pulling in the cold. She felt the movement where their shoulders were almost touching. You should go inside, she said. That side needs heat, not cold air. Probably. That's not a debate, that's medical fact. You sound certain. I am certain. She stood up, her knees protesting as they had been protesting for weeks, consistent and unimpressed. Come on. He stood, slower than usual because of the wound, and for a moment she was beside him at his height, looking at the same stretch of mountain, the same hard stars. Elena, he said. She looked at him. For what it's worth. He said it simply, without performance. I'm glad I went to town that day. She held his gaze. So am I, she said. They went inside and the door closed behind them, and the mountain held its cold and its silence the way it always had, vast and unchanged, indifferent in the way that contains no malice, just the simple fact of a world that was here before people arrived, to struggle on its face and would be here long after. But inside the cabin the fire was warm, and the night was no longer something to survive. That was enough. That was more than enough.
Forever and ever.
What the hell is going on with their bodies, man?
Technically there was one thing at the door, but I don't care to go get it, I'm gonna be honest. Because I believe it's 7, which I think means monsters spawns, I think. So yeah,
I say we blow those bitch.
No!
First lever,
Yeah, just hold it.
No!
Bomba.
Why?
There's so much more money, dude! I got so much shit down there! Oh my god! No! What are they doing? They're trolling, man. They're fucking trolling, actually.
How do you dance?
Press 1, press 1.
Oh my god, Xerti's fucking fired, bro. I'm so serious, Xerti's fired.
Why?
Oh my god, Zerta, you pussy, bro! There was so much at the bottom of the elevator! I just dropped an egg and died on accident because it blew me the fuck up!
Oh, sounds like we're supposed to read minds, Dirty. Did you know that?
Sounds like you should at least go check. There was a loot item still there. He just went, oh, I don't want to go get that.
Yeah, I was like, your body's 20%. I think you're
Bro.
with me.
I've been fucking something up right now.
Holy shit, you guys are some slackers, bro.
You can hear me?
Yes. Yes, bro.
Just fucking it up. I was told
your
to be
flashlights on the
shit,
floor, by the
bitch.
way.
That's what I did.
Damn it all, man.
I blame Genius.
How about you blow me?
For free?
Hey, watch out for the water.
Good comms, good
Dude,
comms.
Megan is listening.
We've already discussed it, Ben. You're my hall pass.